Morning.
Hi, good morning. Okay, let me start off by asking any questions, any issues about what we've been doing. Is this an easy course? Is this a difficult course? Is this a difficult course? That's a genuine question. Or is it, is it the right amount of intellectual curiosity and the material to be covered? Or is it a difficult course compared to your...
So I've come at this having spent my first term trying to learn economics from Nico, and having no economics background. That first term was really hard. Whereas this term, lots of what we're doing on the economic side is sort of refresher or just slightly different angle to what we did in the first term. So for me, it's not too bad, but I can see if I'd not done that first term, then the economic side of it would be much harder. But that's just me personally, because I'm an engineering background, not economics.
So yeah, no, it's meant to be a course where you don't need an economics background. But I mean, does it connect to Nico's course? I mean, does it build upon what Nico's been talking about?
Yeah. I mean, I couldn't put my fingers on an exact example, but lots of the, so in fact, what we were talking about, the reading, the prisoner dilemma, but, the public good and the use of stuff. So some of that is linked into some of the work we did in the first term. So that's useful.
Okay, that's great.
But that's only my opinion. I mean, there's lots of others on here who might have an opposite view. So I'll be quiet.
Yeah, does anybody else have an opinion? The reason I'm asking is because it's a course which is being delivered properly for the first time. This is last year was the first time I did the course, but as you would appreciate, while we were halfway through the course, we shut down. So we never got to the end of the course, and I was never able to get a sense of how the course was from the students. So, I mean, if you have any thoughts on this, that would be very, very helpful. Okay, let me just get okay, so again, for some reason, why isn't it here? Okay, give me a second. Okay, so we're on to lecture 4. Is this connecting? Okay, so we are on to lecture 4. And what we'll do in lecture 4 is start off by refreshing some of the concepts. So we've been looking at some of the concepts in the first 3 lectures. What happened here? I'm really sorry, give me a second. It is all working properly. The last time I checked, but. Okay, there we are. So let's look at what we've done so far. So the first lecture was basically a sense of motivation of why is economic growth critical for improving living standards. There's a lot of debate. A lot of people disagree that economic growth is the right measure to look at. And as we saw, economic growth may not be the best measure to look at, but it captures information in such a way that it allows us to make decisions. And it is correlated, highly correlated with the living standards, right? So if you pick up a measure on the living standards like infant mortality or literacy rate, any of those measures may be a better, may give a better indication of what the living standards are, but you can't make practical choices based on that. So from there, we moved in the lecture 2 to mechanics of growth. And the key thing we understood in the mechanics of growth is a simple message. There are lots of subtleties which I've left behind, given the nature of the course. Economic growth is an area which has about 3,000 to 4,000 papers. It has been a really vibrant area of research for the last 60 years. So, obviously anything that I do in one lecture is a disservice to it. But what we basically understood was that the key phenomena that was important for developing countries was capital accumulation, right? And next lecture, when I wrap this up, I will pin down why exactly capital accumulation is more important for developing countries. For developed countries, there are other more important issues if they want to have sustained growth. But the key thing that we learned from there, and the key message to remember, is that growth is about capital accumulation, whatever capital means. And again, next lecture, I'm going to talk a little bit about what does capital actually mean? What are different kinds of capital? But the key message we took away was it's all about capital accumulation. And because it's all about capital accumulation, the assumption that we made about capital is crucial. So the assumption that we made about capital is that capital tends to have diminishing returns. What does that mean? That means the marginal product of capital. What is the marginal product of capital? If you add 1 unit of capital, how much does your output go up by? That's your marginal product of capital. So assumption we made was the marginal product of capital decreases as we add more capital. And that intuitively makes sense. And when you get a little bit of capital, like a kind of a barely working laptop, it increases your productivity, but it doesn't dramatically increase your productivity. It increases the productivity, but as you improve the quality of laptops, your productivity does not increase by the same amount. It increases by a smaller and smaller amount as we go on. Similarly, as we add capital, what it does, it makes the workers more productive, right? So think about any firm. Think about a firm that makes canned goods. Now, if you want to increase the output of canned goods in your firm, what can you do? You can increase the factors that you use, factor inputs. So that's either capital or labor or ideas. These are the 3 factor inputs that we use. You can always come up with a better idea of doing things, but there are limits to that. You can increase your capital. So you can make a very capital intensive process where you use a lot of machines. But as you increase your capital, your output will go up, but by a smaller and smaller amount. And at some point, you can add as much capital as you want. Your output will not go up, right? So the returns to capital are diminishing. The reason I'm stressing on this is key. This is the key reason why developing countries tend to have low per capita income. The same thing is true for labor as well, that the marginal product of labor has diminishing returns. So as you add more and more labor, the returns to labor are diminishing, the marginal product is diminishing. But that's not crucial because as you add more labor, the returns are diminishing. But if you give that labor more capital and better ideas, the productivity goes up. The key problem is that as you give the workers more and more capital, there are limits to how much the productivity of workers can go up. There's limits to how much output can go up because the returns to capital are diminishing. Now, what may have been confusing, and now that I'm talking about it, this is something I'll clarify in text in the next lecture, but sometimes I talk about marginal product and sometimes I talk about returns, right? So diminishing returns and diminishing marginal product. And I do this subconsciously. And while I was talking to you, I realized that I should make clear why those 2 things are synonymous. The 2 things are synonymous because that's an assumption of the solo growth model. The solo growth model assumes that all markets work perfectly. That's a really, really, kind of a big leap as an assumption is concerned. They assume that the markets work efficiently, that solo growth model tells you what the Pareto efficient outcome for the society is, right? So it's developing countries are not poor. The per capita income is not low in the solo growth model because they are inefficient, and there could be a Pareto improvement. They are poor because of some of the reasons. Now, the assumption they make is that the marginal product of capital is equal to the returns they get. So the return and the marginal product of capital, they are identical. And that means that the markets are assumed to be working perfectly. So when markets work perfectly, the returns you get on your capital is equal to the marginal product of capital. Now, the returns that you get on your capital can be lower than your marginal product of capital, but that implies that the market is not working. Similarly, the returns that you get on labor, wages, if it's equal to marginal product of labor, the underlying assumption there is that the markets are working perfectly, right? So I'll clarify that in next lecture in a slide. In lecture 3, what we learned was this issue of solo growth model assumes Pareto optimality. But actually, if you have small transaction costs associated with accessing the market, then you can be in a suboptimal situation, Pareto-wise, right? So that means a move to reduce transaction cost can actually get you, can lead to a Pareto improvement. So let's think through what happened in the third lecture. In third lecture, we said, look, if you add mobile phones to the fish market, you get a Pareto improvement. Everyone's better off. And the reason everyone's better off is because the capital that they required were not just the fish boats, not just the mobile phones. The capital they required to reduce the transaction cost was a regulatory framework that allowed the mobile phones to work, right? Now, why is that capital? Think of that as public capital. Don't think of that as capital in the sense of machines. Think of that as public capital. Just the way we have social capital and human capital, this is public capital, where the government has a unique role that it can do something in terms of establishing a regulatory framework, law and order. It can do something which costs a little bit, but potentially makes everyone better off. Now, what does that actually mean? That means that the regulatory framework, the cost of putting the regulatory framework in place, it's going to cost something. It's going to be funded out of tax resources. But the benefits from that are so huge that everyone who pays the tax is better off. And that's the definition of Pareto improvement. And so the key thing there is that a decentralized market, and what does a decentralized market mean? Decentralized market means that people who just as individuals are pursuing their own interest, they are not connected in any way. They come at the market and they do things, but there is a role for coordinating all these people by one coordinating authority, which is the role of the government. And what they can do is they can reduce the transaction cost of accessing the market by setting up something which is rather trivial, but has a huge impact. It's rather trivial. The reason it's rather trivial is imagine all the work that is being done by fishermen in going and catching fish from the sea. What the government does, it sets up a regulatory framework for once, and it draws in and creates a market for mobile phones. It draws in mobile phone operators. They reduce the cost. People pay for the mobile phones. It reduces the cost of accessing information. It makes the market works better. Everything is paid for, but everyone's better off. So it's a bit of a magic. Private firms will not be able to do that. Private firms would not be able to establish a mobile phone network on their own. And the reason is because private firms are likely to only make an effort to establish something if they can have a monopoly. I mean, this is very similar to the experience of privatization in UK, where certain industries have privatized and produced lots of benefits, but the rail industry has had a huge problem in privatizing. And initially, when the rail industry was privatized, what they did was they gave the responsibility to the rail industry to maintain the network, the railway system. And this is the same problem that you have at mobile phone operators. If you ask individual companies to maintain the railway network, they would only have the incentive to maintain the network if they get returns from that. It is much cheaper for a coordinating authority to maintain the network. And at some point, after 10 years of privatization, the government had to step in and take a coordinating role. Now, the interesting thing is when we think about infrastructure, we often think about infrastructure as roads, mobile phone networks, and we often think of infrastructure from a perspective of private markets, private firms providing infrastructure. But what I wanted to point out that if you actually go back to it, there is a role, there is a very tiny but a critical role for the government to step in and set up the regulatory framework so that the markets work better, so that the markets do not fail. In the absence of that regulatory framework, there'll be market power, firms will try to monopolize the market, and opportunities for Pareto improvement are missed out. Now, what's interesting also is the notion of complementarity. So I don't know if this came across in the lecture or when you guys thought about it and reflected on the lecture, you saw that there was a complementarity between the public good that the government was providing, regulatory framework, and the private investment. So once the market starts working better, you have mobile phone operators who are making private investments. You also have fishermen who presumably buy more fish, more boats, more fishing equipment, because once they start buying more fishing equipment, and once they have a market where they can predict what's going to happen, and remember the price volatility went down. So once the market becomes more predictable, they have greater incentives to invest more because they are now in a predictable market. Right. So the key thing there was that there's complementarity between public goods and markets. And I will hint at this in this lecture towards the end, and I'll finish up the argument in the next lecture about how this is connected to urbanization. So urbanization is basically the countries that cannot afford, in the development context, urbanization is countries which cannot afford to provide public goods across the country because they just don't have enough taxes. They just don't have enough money, often tend to provide better quality public goods in the urban areas because urban areas, public goods is much, much cheaper. So if you think of street lighting, for a developing country like Kenya, to light up Nairobi, the cost of lighting per capita is very low. But if they wanted to provide sufficient street lighting for everyone who lives in Kenya, that would be much, much higher because in rural areas, population density is low. So urban areas are areas where you can provide better quality public goods, draw in investment, and start off the development process where investment takes place and you accumulate capital. And this is why in developing countries, urban areas often become the center of growth. Okay, so that's the argument we were trying to go towards. We will talk about public goods in urban environment in this lecture. The last thing I wanted to talk about is that there is an area called infrastructure, and there is an area called infrastructure network or infrastructure systems. Infrastructure often looks at things from the perspective of firms and private enterprise about how to participate in that market. The area of infrastructure systems or infrastructure network is a very vibrant area which looks at how do you create the network, how do you get the system rolling? And at that point, in this literature, you cannot get away from the fact that you need a coordinating body. You can either have a coordinating body from the group of people themselves, or you need a coordinating body from the government. So the example of a coordinating body where the profession itself, the industry itself is able to provide a coordinating body. The example that comes to mind is when it comes to medicine. So when it comes to medicine, doctors are providing a very specialized service to us. And it's very difficult to evaluate the quality of that service through litigation. So if you go to courts, the service is so specialized that the judges may not have that information. And to be able to get courts to deliver judgment on tricky issues becomes very difficult. So the British Medical Association is a coordinating body that has emerged from within doctors. And what this does is plays the same coordinating role that we saw in lecture 3, the government was playing. In the absence of that, you may need the government to step in. So it's not necessarily a role for the state. The state only needs to step in if the market itself is not able to find a coordinating role. Similarly, for lawyers, you have to be part of the bar association if you want to be a lawyer. And if you do something which is not correct, the bar association punishes you. And of course, there are other recourse, but often most of the issues are sorted out by the bar association. And here, the analogy that I like to use in terms of understanding this process is simply this. Let's say all of us in this course, we decided that we're going to have a day out and we're going to race each other, right? So we'll have a series of races, and whoever wins the race goes to the next round. And we finally find the person who runs the fastest, or finally find the person who does something, whatever the, it could be egg spoon race, it could be three-legged race. Now, the first thing we'd have to do is we'd have to agree to the rules through which we compete, right? So if you don't have rules, then in the race, are you allowed to kind of push somebody? So if you're trying to run and you want to win the race and somebody else is getting ahead of you, can you pull at their t-shirt? Can you knock them down? We have to agree to have a set of rules and then compete. And so for any market to work, what you have is the range of areas in which you can compete and the range of areas where you have to cooperate in establishing the rules, right? So markets only work if they compete in the right direction. If there are no rules for the markets don't work. And this is the key thing in understanding the market, which is markets set a set of rules so that you can compete. The rules require cooperation so that you can start a competition. So the relationship between cooperation and competition is complicated. And when it comes to markets that do not automatically develop rules of cooperation on their own, the government needs to step in, and which is often the case in development, right? So now we will take this today and take it forward and think about why public goods provisions in developing countries are important and how infrastructure is important. So what also often people think of is infrastructure as everything, whereas there are hierarchies within infrastructure. Some infrastructures are absolutely critical and they lead to better delivery of other infrastructure, right? So what we're going to look at is the role of roads and transport link. The reason we used the fish market last time is because I wanted to point out what the role of transport links is in terms of, in terms of the fish market. And we're going to, it will help you better understand what roads do. So if you think about being a fisherman and you're coming back to the fish market, if you're in the sea, you can take any route and get to any fish market. It gives you a flexibility to move across space. Now that is something that only happens when you're on sea. And this is why water bodies can be very useful, broad water bodies, because they allow you to go in any direction, right? lakes and seas. But for most markets, the way you will traverse space is predetermined by the roads you have, right? So the roads become critical in terms of giving you market access. So the fishermen who were coming back on the Kerala coast had access to 15 markets, whereas if you were in the middle of a country, you may only have access to 2 markets, and your cost of accessing those markets is determined by the roads you have. What is the quality of the road? Is there public transport on it or not? Can you walk on that road? And one of the fascinating things about developing countries is that roads in developing countries are made by middle-class engineers, decided by middle-class politicians and policymakers, and they are all people who never visualize how the poor use the road. So they make roads on which vehicles can go faster, and vehicles are often kind of, you need to be middle class to own a vehicle. Roads are often made where there are no payments. So roads are extremely dangerous. Even if they exist, they can be extremely dangerous. You could live about 5 or 10 miles away from a market town, but it's very dangerous for you to access the road unless and until the person who's planned the road has planned access for people who want to walk there, right? So infrastructure development creates the space that you live in, and roads are extremely important. So the roads are important in giving you market access, and the roads are important in terms of the way information flows, right? So the 2 roles that we saw last time was that in the fish market was that a fisherman could access any market that they wanted to because it was a sea, and the mobile phones played the role of giving them information about the price signals. And that made the market work efficiently. And so in a landlocked area, the roads are critical in determining where the marketplaces would be and how efficient they are in terms of how the information flows. Mobile technology is changing things and making things much easier. So you can see how mobile technology is changing things, and in the middle of Kenya or the middle of now Rwanda, now the flow of information about the prices is much better. But it still means that you have to use the road to access the market. And if enough people cannot move across space, the density is low, the market would never get established. So one of the things that we see is that developing countries have very few rural markets. And in those rural markets, something that I'm not going to cover, but in those rural markets, there is no variety. So there are a very limited number of things that you can buy. Okay, so with this context, you can see where we're going. What we're doing is we are kind of lifting the lid on this big word infrastructure. And we're trying to get to the hierarchy of infrastructure where transport links start becoming critical in terms of establishing other infrastructure projects like social infrastructure, providing social infrastructure like health and education. Okay, that was a bit longer than I thought I would do. Right, so the key bit is to understand that marginal product of capital diminishing is the key assumption in the solo growth model. Solo growth model also makes an assumption about constant returns to scale, but that's not that important because even if we do away with constant returns to scale, we'll still get those properties and we'll get still everything working. That's not the critical assumption. The critical assumption is diminishing marginal product of capital. And you should also remember this because next time I'll talk about endogenous growth theory, and endogenous growth theory talked about how developed countries have been able to counteract diminishing marginal product of capital. The second point that's made here is that the marginal product of capital might be lower. So diminishing marginal product of capital means that as capital increases, the output, so output per worker, as capital per worker decreases, output per worker decreases. So it's this kind of bend that's diminishing returns. But the second point that is that is being made here is that it could be that it's just lower. So there is a lower marginal product of capital, and that leads to lower amount of investment, right? So the example intuitively that I gave you right at the beginning of the course is that electricity pushes up the marginal product of capital. We know that firms that have access to electricity are far more productive than firms that don't. So in an area where you don't have electricity, the marginal product of capital would just shift down, right? So the solo growth model, so we're going over the assumptions of the solo growth model. Solo growth model also assumes, why is this? The solo growth also model assumes that markets work for three kinds of goods. So there are three kinds of, there are three kinds of markets. There's market for consumer goods, there's market for capital goods, and there's market for factor inputs. What are factor inputs? Capital and labor and ideas. All these markets work perfectly. There's no transaction cost of accessing the market. So when you start getting transaction costs for accessing the market, you start deviating away from Pareto efficiency. So with no transaction costs of accessing the market, and if markets are working efficiently, then you're in a Pareto efficient situation, right? Because if markets work efficiently, anybody who values a product which is higher than the cost of producing it, somebody else is producing the good, that trade should take place. Market should work, market should be Pareto efficient. So if there is a transaction cost of accessing the market may not exist. So that means by reducing the transaction cost, you can lead to a Pareto improvement. And we've seen the example of this in the Kerala fish market. So the Kerala fish market, Jensen 2007, is an example where you can make the markets work better if the transaction cost of accessing it is lowered. Okay. Transaction cost of accessing it is lowered, and the transaction cost is lowered both for the suppliers and consumers. So we talked a lot last time in Jensen about how the transaction cost is lowered for the fishermen, because before going, they can find out what the price in the market is. But that also applies to the consumers. The paper doesn't look at the consumers, but it also applies to the consumers, where consumers know whether they have to go to the market or not. They can simply call somebody and say, did you go to the fish market? What is the price like? If the price is low, I'll go. If the price is high, I won't go. We do that all the time. You know, a friend of a friend calls and says, oh, I really tried this new brand of yogurt and it was great. Fantastic. You go and buy that. What are you doing? You're lowering the transaction cost of accessing the market by using your social network to collect information. So mobile phones increase fishermen's profit while reducing consumers' prices in Jensen 2007, and that's a Pareto improvement. That's the definition of Pareto improvement. A good road network, and you can replace good road network with transport network. A good road network or a transport network can play a significant role in reducing the transaction cost of accessing the market and encourage economic activity or economic growth. So markets play a key role in the development process. If you don't have markets, you can't buy something, you can't produce something. So if you can't buy a raw material, you can't, if you can't buy eggs, flour, you can't make a cake. Now, if you want to make a cake, let's say you have egg, flour, butter, you can buy everything, but for some reason, sugar is not available. That's it. One tiny thing and the cake is gone. So a point that I'm not taking you towards because it's slightly more complicated, but it's a really important point in reality, which is the variety in the market that's available starts becoming really important. So if you live in an area where you don't have sugar, you can't make a cake and start a business as far as cakes, for making cakes is concerned. So the smaller the variety, the more limited what you can do in terms of exchange of the market, and the more limited your output. So you may be very, very good at making cakes, but if you live in an area where the markets are not vibrant and you don't have access to sugar, that's it, you're done for. Now, this is absolutely the frontier of the research. There is a lovely paper, working paper, and if you're interested, I can give you a reference to the paper, which is looking at data in Ethiopia. It's a paper by one of my ex-colleagues, Pramila Krishnan. And what they do is they look at data in Ethiopia. And what they look at is how does the variety of goods available in a market go down as you get to remote and remoter locations in Ethiopia. So compared to locations which are better connected, if you go to remote locations, the variety goes down. Now, there is a lot of work on price because price is easier to collect, but this is more difficult because collecting data on variety, what is the range of goods available in local markets? That's a very difficult data to collect. And it's only now that developing economists have been able to collect that. There is a revolution in new trade theory and understanding how international trade takes place. And this took place, and the person who's responsible for that was Paul Krugman, his paper in the 90s. And the key to understanding trade in the 90s, the new trade theory was understanding that as humans, we require variety. And the greater variety that we can access, the better off we are. So the key to international trade between developed countries is variety. This has not been applied yet to developing countries and in the economic development. And there is just some papers that have started looking at this. By the way, an excellent dissertation topic. I know all of you have decided the dissertation, but an excellent thing to look at in terms of how vibrant are the markets? Do they have variety? And the fascinating thing is I moved from London to Cambridge, rural Cambridge, because of the lockdown. Long story, but I moved. And the first thing I noticed was that even between Cambridge, rural Cambridge and London, there was a huge change in variety. So, 1 mile, within 1 mile, I had 3 supermarkets in Camden where I was living, and I could almost buy anything that I wanted to. Whereas here, I'm in a small village outside Cambridge. There's two tiny shops, and the variety available is fairly limited. It's absolutely basic. So if this is true for a developed country, it's even more true for a developing country. Okay. And if variety was simply about consumption, then that would be less of an issue. But variety becomes important even for production processes, because you need a variety of things to produce something. And if one variety is missing, that's it. You're not able to produce this. As I've said before, my lecture slides, wherever I have something that I want to add, sometimes it's part of what I'm telling you. It's just repetition. Sometimes it's extra information. Sometimes it's just repetition of what I'm going to say about the slide. I've got notes after a number of slides. Okay, reflection on public goods. So part of public goods, they are non-rival and non-excludable. And that tells you why you cannot have a market for them. So if a good is non-rival, that means the marginal cost of producing an extra unit is 0, right? So in a market, why would anybody pay for it? If a good is non-excludable, you can't exclude somebody from them. How do you make them pay? You can only make them pay for a good if you can exclude them. If you can't exclude them from the good, you can't make them pay. And so because public goods are non-rival and non-excludable, the market doesn't emerge automatically. Now, the thing we need to remember for public goods are these 2 points. Public goods are critical in lowering the transaction cost of accessing the market. So think of road, canals, mobile phone networks, transport infrastructure. The key bit is that they lower the transaction cost of accessing the market. The second bit is when it comes to public good. And every time I use the word public good, you can replace that with infrastructure. There's a difference between public goods and infrastructure. There is a subtle difference. So there are certain public goods that are not infrastructure, but largely a lot of public goods can also be seen as infrastructure. And the reason I'm saying this is because the definition for infrastructure, even though infrastructure, we constantly talk about infrastructure, the definition for infrastructure is one of those things that everyone has a different definition for infrastructure. It's, as I wrote, I think in my first lecture on the lecture notes, that the definition is, if I see infrastructure, I know it's infrastructure. People don't care to define it. But public goods are very clearly defined, and a lot of infrastructure are public goods, right? So public goods increase the productivity of factor inputs. So in the growth process that we saw, the productivity of factor inputs are extremely important, right? Because if the factor inputs are more productive, if the capital and labor that you use is more productive, then you produce more output, right? So how do they increase the productivity of factor inputs? So think about labor. The key thing for labor is a healthy labor force. So if there's prevalent disease, we all know what happens to the labor force, right? We are living through a pandemic. We all know that if healthcare is not sorted out, it's impossible for the economy to function. Now, if you live in a developed country, this may be unusual for you, but if you live in a developing country, healthcare problems are always there, right? So different parts of the world have different diseases, and these different diseases can become less or more prevalent. The World Health Organization and other organizations and developing countries around the world have done a hugely, I don't know how to end the sentence. They've done a fantastic job of eliminating a number of diseases. And on average, in developing countries, workers are far healthier than they used to be 50 years ago. Vaccination programs have done a great job. There are other ways of prevention that has been undertaken. But the key bit to understand is, if you do not have health infrastructure, you're not going to have a healthy labor force. If you don't have a healthy labor force, you'll not be able to produce anything. If you don't produce, you don't have high incomes. The productivity of capital has a different logic. And there the idea is, for capital to be productive, you need some infrastructure, and there is a hierarchy in the infrastructure. Some infrastructure is really important, and other infrastructure is important but less important. And so without roads, your capital is never going to be productive. You can have a lot of capital in the middle of nowhere, but if you don't have roads, you can't get your other inputs and use that capital. You can't sell it to the market. You often cannot use electricity to as mechanical energy to use that capital. So public goods are key to making capital more productive. And my go-to paper is Jensen on that again. So this is a paper which captures various different aspects of development in one paper. And you may think I'm harping too much on this, but it captures various aspects of how public goods can make capital more productive. So health and education is absolutely key. If you don't have a health and education infrastructure, your labor force is going to be far less productive. Law and order, electricity, banks, post offices, they all make capital more productive. Fascinating paper on banks. I'm going to have a reference for you. It's going to be a deep dive reference, but it shows you how some people speculate that the key thing that changed in India in the late 70s was the banking system. So there was a banking system, change in the banking system in the 1970s, which kicked off the development process. There are 4 candidates in this literature, and one of the candidates is banks. But if we were doing a longer course, I would have talked more about it. But turns out, so there's a lovely paper on on this, which shows how the banking reforms in the 1970s made the banking system, rural banking system in India far more efficient. And the fascinating thing here is that the banking reform, it was a very small reform, but the banking reform was undertaken by the government, and it changed the regulatory framework. The banks were still being established by private banks or semi-autonomous banks, but all the government did was used one particular policy to change the framework, and that led to a lot of banks being established in the rural areas. And once banks were established, they connected the rural areas to other parts of the country by moving the savings from that area to productive investment opportunities and getting saving from other areas to that area so that people can invest in that area. And we know from the solo growth model that the saving to investment channel is absolutely key. So by establishing a small policy change, most banks were established in the rural areas in India across in the 70s decade. And once that happened, that area got connected and was able to send savings to other areas and get savings from other areas. And the paper and other papers have talked about how that may have been a key reform. Okay. Sorry, that's at the wrong place. It just moves. Okay. Right. So this takes me to the urban-rural divide in public goods. Urban areas always have better public goods. And then we have a chart and a paper at the end of the lecture, where we talked about this more specifically in the context of Africa. But urban areas, basically, because of population density, the urban areas, it's cheaper to provide public goods in urban areas. So if you want to provide law and order in an urban area, roads in an urban area, electricity is much, much cheaper than to provide it across the country. And so urban areas always have much better public goods. They also have more economic activity. That economic activity is often taxed to provide those public goods, and people who are paying those taxes often don't want public goods to go far away. And that leads you to this kind of vicious cycle. When urban areas have better public goods, they have more economic activity, but they don't want the money to cross-subsidize public goods in other areas. So it's a debate in every country, but if you take a UK, London says it pays more taxes, and so it should have better public goods. When you put public goods in London, you have more economic activity. So if you put a public good in London, if you put a rail system, if you put any public good, it has a huge impact on economic activity, and you get taxes and you can pay it back quite easily. And so the government is able to fund public goods because they know that investment in public goods in London will give you taxes back. But the interesting thing is the economic activity in London is artificially concentrated in London. It reflects economic activity in other parts of the country. So if a supermarket is headquartered in London, it is artificial because the economic activity is taking place like Tesco's or Sainsbury's all across the country. But because it's headquartered in London, you think that the economic activity is in London. So urban areas also have this thing, that, also there's some kind of artificiality, which is firms that are centered in urban areas. Often, if you look at the accounts, it reflects that the urban areas are far more productive than they actually tend to be. But on the whole, urban areas tend to be more productive, and public goods are much cheaper to provide. Public goods are much cheaper when it comes to provision in urban areas. Okay, the role of the government. And this is where I kind of mentioned my paper from 2018. And the key bit here is thinking about the government's production function. So we haven't talked about government as an actor. We've talked about firms as an actors. They take labor and capital and produce goods. The government does the same thing. So government uses public capital right? So government owns public capital. You can think of it as the actual capital they own, or you can think of it as some of the public goods that are being produced. So let me take that back. So the government owns a certain amount of public capitals, government employs workers, and they produce goods and services. So the difference is, unlike firms, they don't produce consumer and capital goods. What the government does is uses capital and labor to produce public goods. Now, what is public capital here? Public capital is a capital owned by the government. And since the government represents the people often, it is collectively owned unless it's an autocracy. If it's autocracy, then the government reflects the person who has the power in the autocracy. Using public capital and the government employs, public goods are produced. Public goods are a range of goods and services produced by government using public capital, right? Given that public goods are non-excludable, you can't charge for them directly. You can't have a direct price for them. So the only way you can pay for them is through taxes. So public goods, they cannot be paid through directly. They have to be paid by taxes because public goods have a non-exclusion. They are non-excludable. Okay, so provision of public goods versus markets, right? And this is the key thing that we constantly get stuck on. If you want roads, should it be provided by a private sector in terms of firms in a market, or should it be done by the government? So should the government provide public goods or leave the provision to market? So the pros are, and I have a slight problem with my indentation here. The cons should have been indented out. So pros are that a market fails to provide non-rivalry and non-excludable goods. So anything which is non-rival and non-excludable, so it's difficult to provide for a market to provide it. And the adequate provision of public goods requires well-functioning markets. And once they start functioning well, it makes capital labor more productive, which encourages economic growth. So the pro is that if the government provides it, it kind of feels the key area. It can allow people to improve their living standards, right? That's a pro for the government providing it, because in the absence of the government providing it, if there's inadequate provision, that's going to constrain the society from improving its living standard. The con is that governments don't have incentive to reduce cost. So what binds a firm together is that at the end of the day, firms often have some form of profit motive. They could have some social objective, but that is an additional bit. All firms want to break even. Some firms want to maximize profits. Other firms want to break even. They all have an incentive to reduce cost, whereas a government is inefficient because it doesn't have an explicit incentive to reduce cost. A public servant working in a government doesn't have an explicit interest. And it all boils down to also that we as voters are not well informed, and we don't push governments towards reducing costs. So if all the voters started punishing governments and political parties which were not able to reduce cost, you can turn government into some entity which tries to reduce cost, but often that's a process. It's a process that doesn't. It happens in some countries. It happens in Switzerland, where they vote on a regular basis and everyone is extremely involved in the political process, but it doesn't happen in most countries. So the pros are government providing something inefficiently can actually be helpful. So inadequately provided malaria program or inadequate provision of education can make, over a period of time, workers more productive, or in other cases, make other public goods can make the capital more productive. but it's going to be inefficient. Government has no incentive to be efficient on its own. And when I think of government, I don't think of political leaders, I'm talking over the bureaucracy. Okay, so examples of public goods, and this becomes a huge range. So road building in Kenya. So this is the example that we're going to talk about in the next half an hour. For the next half an hour, we'll talk about road building in Kenya and how, we'll look at the details of road building in Kenya and how the road building in Kenya has been influenced by the political process. So there's a kind of interesting idea there. Regulatory framework for mobile networks. We saw this last time. Schools and hospital in the poorest, schools and hospital that cater, sorry, they should have had, that cater to the poorest of the poor. Schools and hospital in rural areas. Preventing deforestation, national defense, law and order, constitution. So, these are kind of range of examples that you cannot but do with the government. You're right. So let's look at road building in Kenya. And the road building in Kenya, for various set of reasons, is really useful to study because it tells us something about the development process, or it tells us why the development process can suddenly get arrested. So Kenya got independent in 1963, and from 1963, it has moved back and forth between democracy and autocracy. So this is the period where it has been in autocracy, but it started off with democracy. 63 to 69 was democracy, and 93 onwards, it's been democratic. But from 1970 to 1992, it was an autocracy. And what is interesting to note, it's just a small point, but interesting to note, is Moi was both an autocrat and a democrat. So till 1992, from 79 to 92, he was an autocrat. And from 93 to 2002, he became a democrat, as in was democratically elected. And that's a rare example because you don't often see autocrats becoming democrats. Kenyatta, on the other hand, the influential kind of influential political force in the early life of independent Kenya, was somebody who was Democrat and became an autocrat. So till 69, he was a Democrat, democratically elected, and from 1970 to 1978, he became an autocrat. And the question we want to ask is, what did that do to the role building system in Kenya? And not in terms of whether Kenya built more roads during autocracy or whether it built more roads during democracy. That misses the point. The point that this paper goes to, the point this paper that we're going to looks at is, where were the roads built? So where did autocrats build their roads and where did Democrats build their road? And to give away the answer, autocrats built their roads in areas where they had ethnic similarity. And Democrats built roads in all areas. So autocrats built roads in areas where people of their tribal, tribal background lived, whereas Democrats built roads everywhere. Okay. Now, if you look at Kenya, 1970 to 1992, the period that we talked about, that's the period of autocracy. So this period is the period of autocracy. And the key thing to notice is this. So in this example, the dotted line is this line here is Kenya. And the solid line is the rest of sub-Saharan Africa. Now, what you notice is at the start of the autocratic period in 1970, Kenya was growing much, much faster than sub-Saharan Africa. So it was an economy which was outperforming its region. By the end of the autocratic period, and that's here, by the end of the autocratic period, its growth rate had come down to sub-Saharan Africa, right? So the democracy, decision-making in democracy before 1972 changed something in the economic system, and Kenya grew faster and faster. But over the period of autocracy, it got closer and closer to sub-Saharan Africa, and that impact has continued. And the reason is that any decision that you make today is going to have an impact for the next 20, 30 years. I mean, a lot of decisions can change easily, other decisions get baked in. So if the decisions get baked in, they lower the kind of growth capacity of a country. And autocracy, those decisions that were made in autocracy lowered, and today Kenya is underperforming sub-Saharan Africa. Now, the reason this is striking is because sub-Saharan Africa is not the best example of a fast-growing area of the world. So Kenya, which was outperforming sub-Saharan Africa before autocracy, is now underperforming sub-Saharan Africa, even though it has democracy. And the autocracy has left its mark in terms of decisions that change the structure of the economy, and the decision got baked in, and that's what we want to look at. So why did Kenya underperform? So why did Kenya underperform its neighbors during autocracy? So leaders have discretion in autocracy. So discretion is a key word here. The leaders have discretion in how the government spends its money, and what kind of public goods it provides. And if you have a suboptimal provision of public goods, what that means is that the government is not responding optimally to the socioeconomic needs of the population. Why socioeconomic needs? Economic needs is where you have needs that can improve your economic vibrancy, economic activity. Social needs is when you need, if you need safety, if you need law and order, if you need healthcare. That is not just economic. It's not just economic end. It's also the social end, which may feed into economic end, may not feed into economic end, but is a role of the government to provide public goods that meets the socioeconomic need of the population. But in autocracy, you have discretion. Whereas in democracy, you may not have discretion, because if you do the wrong thing, you may not come back. You may not get elected back. So the suboptimal allocation of public goods, in this example, we're looking at roads, but road here is a representative example. The paper is looking at roads because we have data on roads. There are lots of other important public goods like law and order, which are intangible. You can't look at it because you don't find data on it. So if during autocracy, law and order was improved, more police stations were created, more police were hired in certain areas, and other areas were allowed to deteriorate, it becomes more difficult to collect data on this. But as road, the data is tangible. And so I go back to this point that I think I've made before, which is we are driven through tangible things that we can document, but we should always be careful about what lies behind the surface. The tangible things that we see is like the tip of the iceberg. It is often representative of a lot of other tangible things. So what we want to read into this is not just about making roads. What we want to read into this is how do we kind of ensure that optimal decision-making process takes place in developing countries. And one of the things that we know is autocracy is going to put it out of whack. Now, the question is, can you actually influence autocracy in a country? Turns out as institutions outside the world institutions do actually have an ability to influence whether the country descends into autocracy or remains a democracy. They do not have really powerful tools, but they do have. And so often the question is, are you going to emphasize certain public goods provisions? So I'm talking about from the perspective of the UN. Are you going to emphasize certain public goods provision, or are you going to use that to get democracy working in an area? And these are difficult choices, right? Anyway, I'm going to leave it at that. So we go back to suboptimal allocation of public goods. Could mean high transaction costs for access to the market, lower marginal productivity of private capital, lower economic growth. Okay. Now, what I'm trying to do here, and I'm just going to step back and tell you what I'm trying to do here. What I'm trying to do here is show a light in terms of all the channels through which infrastructure has an impact on economic growth. Rhetorically, everyone says infrastructure is good for economic growth. But if infrastructure is good for economic growth, you should build more roads. But if you build more roads at the wrong places, you're actually making the thing worse. You're actually creating certain haves and creating other have-nots. You're taking away, what some people are entitled and giving it to others. So it's important to understand the channels through which infrastructure has an impact on economic growth, and understanding the channels requires understanding all the small pathways. So if roads are going to have an impact on economic growth, it's by reducing transaction cost, making factors more productive, health, education, hospitals. These are complicated pathways. These are not simple things like saying, let's build more infrastructure. Simple ideas like let's build more infrastructure is actually what often causes problem in economic development. And the best example of this is Latin American countries. In the late 70s, the financial system across the world decided that Latin American countries are really good as far as credit is concerned. And there is something called the sovereign hypothesis. The head of the Citibank said, a country can never go bankrupt. And that became the sovereign hypothesis. You can lend as much as you want to the country, it can never go bankrupt. Turns out it was absolutely wrong, because countries default. They don't go bankrupt, but they do default. So a lot of money was lent to Latin America in the 70s. And at that point, the LIBOR, the interest rate, the kind of key interest rate on which the loans were based, was low. When the LIBOR increased, the interest rate increased, Latin American countries through the 80s onwards decided they just didn't have money to pay. And the reason is this, because a lot of money was lent to Latin America. Latin America ended up building a lot of infrastructure, but it ended up building infrastructure which had no impact on economic activity. And because it had no impact on economic activity, they did not have access to pay back. And so the idea is infrastructure is not necessarily good for development. It can actually be terrible for the government, for development. If infrastructure leads to default, that means it really disrupts the economic activity, or the kind of the activity of the government. So it can be terrible. The key thing is that the devil is in the detail, and the devil is in the multiple pathways. So when you think of infrastructure, you have to distinguish between hospital, flyovers, railways, and roads, and you have to find pathways. And by the way, the term paper I'm going to set for you, I'm going to ask you to talk about the pathways. So any rhetorical statements in the term paper, you're going to be marked down. So, rhetorical statements like infrastructure is good for development, that's not what I want you to take away. What I want you to take away is the numerous pathways. And, there are such large number of pathways that I don't want comprehensive kind of analysis of all the pathways, but I want a greater nuanced understanding from you in terms of these pathways. So I will ask you in the term paper to connect infrastructure to its impact on economic growth, and pin down what the pathways are. And it would be there by tomorrow, the term paper. So it will be there on the Moodle. Okay, going back to this, the key criticism of African countries has been the following: that the reason they haven't progressed is because of this pattern of ethnic favoritism. So the idea of ethnic favoritism is when a member of a particular ethnic group controls the government and influences government expenditure in order to disproportionately benefit the members of their own group, right? So if you're a particular ethnic group and you take control of the government, ethnic favoritism is when you only want to reward people who belong to the same ethnic group. And if you want to deliver your public goods based on socioeconomic needs, that's not ethnic favoritism. So that's the other side. One of the things that Collier has written a lot about, Paul Collier, who's kind of an interesting writer. He's become controversial of late, if you know about Paul Collier, but he's also somebody who's written a lot about Africa and has written really interesting things in his early bit. So if you know about Paul Collier from his recent writings, his recent writings are a bit off the mark, and he's become very controversial for that. His early bits are really, really interesting. So Paul Collier often has made the point, and in this particular article with Gunning, the references are in the reading list, he makes the point that one of the reasons Africa has lacked economic progress is this pattern of ethnic favoritism. And add to that the fact that Africa is ethnically more divided than other regions of the world. So in countries where you have a lot more ethnic linguistic fractionalization, lots and lots of different groups, you have a bit of an issue in terms of what happens when somebody that represents somebody who's of one particular ethnic group comes to power. Right? And if you want to think about it in European terms, the country which epitomizes this is Belgium. And having lived in Belgium for a bit, I was always fascinated by how, if you meet a Belgian, they are more likely to say they are Flemish or French Belgian than likely to say they are Belgian. I mean, this was 20 years ago. Things are changing now, but it's an excellent example. Belgium is an excellent example which remains dysfunctional because there are two ethnic groups, and the two ethnic groups can never kind of come together to form a national identity. All right. So government expenditure driven by ethnic favoritism creates imbalances. If powerful ethnic groups are favored in terms of public goods, that reduces the country's ability to grow significantly. Now, it's easy to say that ethnic favoritism is the problem, right? So, when you see success, you can say success is because of a number of reasons. Actually proving that something has actually been critical for success is more difficult. So, we know that the developing countries have progressed a lot. We can all see that. Within developing countries, the GDP of Switzerland is much higher than UK. US GDP is much higher than most developed countries. Why is US doing so well in terms of GDP per capita? In other areas in terms of inequality, you may challenge whether US is doing well or not. Turns out, when people try to think about this, they often think and say, "Oh, US is doing this. It's also US is following X policy. It's also doing really well. X policy must be why it's doing well." Turns out, showing it empirically starts becoming more difficult. So the same thing is with failure. Take a country which is not progressing, per capita income is not growing at a robust pace. And you can always say, they did this policy C, and that's why they're not going. But actually showing how that has an impact is more difficult. Okay, somebody think in the chat. Let me just check. Okay, really interesting question from Aristia. Is infrastructure for Olympic Games investment without prosperity for economic growth in developed countries? You know, the devil is in the detail. The fact that the funding is for Olympic Games is incidental. Olympic Games are always held in urban areas. Urban areas are always have more public goods. When you spend for Olympic Games, the question is, have you matched cost and benefits? Have you kind of worked out how it's going to change economic activity? I can't think of almost any example where Olympic Games has changed the nature of the city. It's an area that frankly, I haven't looked at very carefully. To a large extent, Olympic Games tend to waste money. But when you say they tend to waste money, you would always have to think about what is the alternative. So we spend more money in urban areas anyway. If we don't, like, if you take the Olympics in London, the question is, did UK spend more money in London because of the Olympic Games? Or would it have anyway ended up spending more money in London because UK tends to spend a lot more money in London? That's a difficult question to answer. Does Olympic Games on its own bring in any kind of benefits? That's an empirical question. And I, at least, from my recollection, do not know of any city which has dramatically changed, or any country which has dramatically changed its course because of Olympic Games. And one of the key things there is that Olympic Games are always held in cities which are capital cities or large cities, which are already doing much better than the rural areas. So the really interesting way to look at this would be, what if we held the Olympic Games in a small town which is struggling? So, take any example from any country, take a small area take a city that is underdeveloped, and look at what impact it would have if you spend all that money in that area. And the answer is going to be very unpredictable. So it's connected to something else that Paul Romer has been talking about. So Paul Romer is the person who developed endogenous growth theory. We've done solo growth model. Endogenous growth theory was the next step in the 80s. It talked about economic growth in the developed countries. So next lecture, you will get a better sense of what endogenous growth was. So Paul Romer did that work in the 80s. And since then, he's been talking about charter cities. So he's been talking about how you can take a city, put in a lot of public goods in that city. And the question is, will that lead to economic progress? And one of the fascinating things is that it's become really controversial. And the prospect of creating a charter city also has allegedly led to a coup in a particular country. So, the jury is a bit out on that. But the way I'll take your question, Ristia, is, should you spend a large chunk of money in a particular area to develop something? And the answer to that question is, we know from a Latin American experience, is spending large amounts of money on infrastructure is not the solution. Often the solution is to find the complementarity between capital and public capital, and complementarity between labor productivity and public capital. Okay, so let me put this down in writing. The key for policy making here is you take public capital and you're going to use that to produce a public good. And Olympics is an example where you're investing in infrastructure to produce public good. And what you want to look at is complementarities with productivity of labor and productivity of capital. So spend money in such a way so that labor and capital become more productive. And that is the key thing. If you are able to make your labor and capital more productive, example of making capital more productive, electricity, transport. Examples of making labor more productive, health, education, law and order. And this is the safest way to go. If you are able to justify how you're going to kick off a process, and this is why I'm very critical of the cost benefit analysis. What you don't want to do is pin down the cost and benefits. What you want to do is say, I want to start a domino effect. So how do I spend public money to provide public goods that are going to start a domino effect, right? Making the road at the right place is going to start a domino effect because it's going to create a market, create variety, create more economic activity, which can be taxed to provide more public goods. It's going to start a domino effect. So the key thing to look for is not simple cost and benefit. Key thing to look for is the domino effect from your public good expenditure. Because at the end of the day, governments have a disadvantage. They're very inefficient in terms of actually doing things. But they have a key advantage, which is they are able to coordinate. They are able to extract price where other firms cannot. So by taxing, they can get people to pay for the services, but firms cannot do that. They can also play the role of coordinating bodies where other firms will not do that. They will create monopolies, right? So the key bit is to understand how can you use public policy to start off a domino effect. And if you're able to start off a domino effect, the public policy has been useful. Okay. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Yeah, but it's a very good question. I mean, it's a really interesting question, and the fact that I was scratching my head to answer it means
yeah,
that
I was trying to understand if an investment in Olympic Games was efficient for the next years. And as you said, I think from my understanding, it didn't stimulate the market after the Olympics.
So it depends on the quality of the decision-making process. That was my answer.
Okay. Yeah.
In the sense that if I give you some money to do some good, the question is, will you do good or not? It entirely depends on who you are as a person and your capability, right? Okay. And so Olympic Games can potentially be a force for good. They have never been, but that doesn't mean they can't be. But the key problem is that the reason they're never a force for good is because, usually they amplify problems that already exist in the society. Right?
Right.
And take a rural area, and I presume you're Greek, right?
Yeah, right. That's why I asked for Olympic Games.
Yeah, this is Athens, right? So the interesting question to ask yourself is, instead of holding the Olympic Games in Athens, if they had done it in another remote part of Greece, would that have made a difference, right? But just the way roads don't have payments, because the people who make decisions are people who never walk, they use cars. The same way, policymakers can never visualize spending all that money in an area where they don't live. And that explains why Olympic Games are always held in capital. Anyway. Okay.
Yeah, good point. I got that. Thank you.
Right. So, and this relates really nicely to what we're going to talk next, which is what democracy always does is tries to get government and whoever's running the government to respond to what is the socioeconomic needs. And here I will use the word autocracy carefully, because I'm using autocracy the word way the paper uses it. But China makes a really interesting point, because China says democracy is not key. What's key is accountability. So if you have local political leaders and local bureaucracy which is accountable, you can actually do it. Democracy is not key. And when you look at the expenditure pattern in China, and it's spectacular how good it is. You've seen that kind of pattern. You rarely see that kind of pattern in any developing country, whereas China has emerged out of a kind of a poverty trap. And in terms of infrastructure production, infrastructure placement, they have often placed infrastructure as a light place, right? So even though this paper uses autocracy, the key question is, and this also answers the question, Aristia, the key question is whether the policy making is accountable to the society or not, whether the society can influence or kind of push back against the policy making and make it accountable. Okay, so what this paper does is looks for empirical evidence to find whether ethnic favoritism plays a part in road making process, and how that ethnic favoritism is impacted by the political system, autocracy versus democracy. So the key problem with finding evidence is this, that if the key problem with finding the evidence is this, that if ethnic favoritism means that you prefer area A over area B, then that may have started off you saying, I'm going to provide more public goods in area A. But if you start providing more public goods in area A and people start moving to area A, that means that they kind of, people from area B move to area A, that area A's ethnic composition changes. And so the evidence disappears, right? So you you provide more public goods in area A. You did that because of ethnic favoritism, but people can easily move from area B to area A. If they can do that, they move to area A, and that's it. Your evidence has disappeared. So social scientists always have found it really difficult to find evidence of ethnic favoritism. It's something that is easily said. You can make that point, but to actually find evidence has been difficult. Kenya is key to this, because in Kenya, because of a colonial era regulation, ethnic districts had ethnic homogeneity. And because of a bunch of reasons, the composition of the district has not responded to the change in provision of public goods, right? So, there's a long bit on the paper on this, but basically the idea is that due to ethnic favoritism in Kenya, certain areas have got more public goods, but people haven't changed where they lived because of that. And that's why Kenya is one of those unusual examples where you can study this and find evidence for ethnic favoritism. So what Burgess et al. Do in their paper is they look for two research questions. And you're going to start writing your dissertations very soon. When you write a dissertation, it's very good to have a very clear set of research questions. Otherwise, you kind of read a lot, you write something, but when you finish, you might start asking yourself, what is the question I answered? If you can write down your question in one sentence or two sentences, then you know where you're going. So it's like a roadmap. So the question they're answering is, does the president influence the government in terms of building more roads and districts where people of his ethnicities lives? Ethnic favoritism. does the nature of the political system influence road building? So there are two separate questions. Can the president have an influence on where the roads are built, right? Because we don't know whether a president can or cannot. You know, it may be that the government is working and the bureaucracy is working and the president's powers are limited. So the first question is asked is, does the president have an influence? And the second question is asked is, does the nature of the political system influence road building? So to understand this, they define a very key measure, which is the road population share. Basically what this says is this: in district A, let's say district A, what proportion of the total road expenditure was spent in district A in a particular year? And what proportion of the population lives in district A? So if this road measure was greater than 1, that means the district is proportionally getting more road expenditure than the population that lives there. If it's less than 1, that is getting less. And if it's equal to 1, that means it's getting a fair share, right? So the other thing is identifying president's co-ethnic district. That basically means that the president, if he, and you know, it's never been she in Kenya as far as I know, but the president is from a particular ethnic category, you can easily identify which are the districts that correspond to his ethnic identity. Okay, so this roads population share tells you that if a particular district is getting a road population share of 3, that means it's getting 3 times the road spending that it should be getting given the population that stays there. Okay, so the first figure, what it does is tells us what is happening to the road share. And the key thing to notice is that so this doesn't tell you who the president is. It basically says whoever's the president, what is happening to the road share in their co-ethnic district, in the district of their ethnic identity. So the line, the blue line, this is what's happening in the districts of the president. And this, the other line, which I'm going to highlight in green, is what's happening in other districts. So the districts that have the fortune of being in the president's, sharing the ethnic identity with the president, get a higher share of road expenditure during the autocratic period from 1970 to 1992, but also after that during the democratic period. Wasn't true before 1970. So before, if you look before 1970, the first phase of democracy, in the first phase of democracy, so first phase of democracy was this, the second phase of democracy was this, and the middle phase is this. This is the autocratic period. So during democracy, it started off by road share not being very different, evenly spread. But since 1970, the road share in the president's district has been high, irrespective of whether the country is autocratic or democratic. Now let's look at this. So what this does is looks at these 2 different tribes, the Kikuyu tribe and the Kalenjin tribe. I hope I'm pronouncing this right. And what it does is it shows what happens to these districts in different period. And so what you see, and this is the best kind of evidence is here in this era. You can see how in 1978, suddenly the Kikuyu district started losing road expenditure and the Kalenjin district started gaining road expenditure. Now the paper is full of really careful empirical analysis. It's published in one of the top journals. So everything is done very carefully, but this gives you an example of what happens when presidents change. The ethnic tribe, which shares its ethnic identity with the president, starts getting more. The same thing again starts happening here, right? The blue line overtakes the red line, right? So the switchback often happens and coincides with new presidents coming in. Okay. Now, the main result of Burgess, what they find is that there is ethnic favoritism in Kenya. And they find that ethnic favoritism is much more pronounced during autocracy, and it disappears or becomes, the ethnic favoritism becomes far less during democracy. The way in which ethnic favoritism has been defined is in terms of the share of expenditure that you're getting for road given your population, right? So that's not the only thing we should be looking at. It's just that when it comes to road expenditure, it's very difficult to hide road expenditure. But this would be reflective of public goods being provided in co-ethnic districts. So during autocracy, there is discretion, and the president often uses the discretion, whereas the amount of ethnic favoritism goes down during democracy. Okay, so using this, keeping this at the back of our minds. So the last bit that is very key is this, which is the reversal, and this is the point the paper makes, the reversal, once you get democracy, even though you get more even distribution, the road deficit that has been accumulated over the period of autocracy has not been overcome. So if areas which have been favored have got more roads, that is not an easy thing to overcome. So I was just reading a paper on Spain yesterday, and it finds that Spain builds motorway, and Spain has built a lot of motorways since the 1970. It's one of the largest motorway networks in Europe, but the road network follows the pattern which was set 500 years ago. So roads are built where roads are already there. Wherever there are roads, you have economic activity. Once you have economic activity, you get more roads. So the density of the roads, actually, the paper tracks it back to 500 years ago, where roads initially were being formed 500 years ago. So, you might think this is just a little more roads for somebody, some areas, but it can dramatically, building of the roads can dramatically change the society and its future economic activity. And this is where it's very important to remember the hierarchy of infrastructure investment. Some infrastructure investment is malleable. Even if you get it wrong, you can pull it back. Other infrastructure is so critical and it's so important for such a range of activities that once you make the decision, you're going to change the history of the world afterwards. And I'm really influenced by some of the French philosophers who were thinking a lot about it in the 1960s. If any of you are interested, I can point you in that direction. These are fascinating people who were thinking about the nature of space and how we as proactive human beings, we interfere with the nature of space. And as we interfere with the nature of space, we change society. And anybody who decides where the road is going to build is changing the nature of the history of the world. But somehow, the analysis of where the roads are going to be built is never taken that carefully. That the burden of what is, how it's going to impact the future generations is never on the people who make it. Roads are always, the decision-making process is not as sophisticated as we'd like it to be. Okay, I'm going to take you a bit through Africa. So this is going to go much faster because the paper, again, like the Kelda paper, the road paper symbolizes something. So it's not just about roads in Kenya. It symbolizes something about decision-making process, and it symbolizes something about decision-making process, which makes development and economic growth and development both more challenging in developing countries. So you have to read it as a representative paper. Okay. Now the thing about Africa is there's a huge variation in the growth process. And Africa remains a mystery. So within developing countries, you have developing countries and then you have Africa. East Asian countries, certain countries in Asia, Latin American countries, these are countries which have been Philip always gets a tea at this point, right? Certain Latin American countries, these are developing countries, they have their challenges, but African countries have a particular set of challenges. And this is captured. So this is a graph of what has happened to the per capita income in various countries across Africa. And what's spectacular is that even though there's been phenomenal progress in countries like Cote d'Ivoire. Look at what happened to Congo. Ethiopia, explosive growth. Kenya, there has been a growth, but Tanzania, Rwanda. So the picture it paints is that because Africa is starting off from a low per capita income base, the growth can be explosive. But what marks Africa is also the collapses have been spectacular. So no other part of the world has seen such spectacular collapses. And, yeah. So Collier 99 makes a really simple point, which is very useful if we keep solo growth model at the back of our mind, which is the investment as a proportion of GDP in Africa is 18%. And Asia, South Asia, which is doing better, the investment is 23% of the GDP. And what this tells you is not that you need to get more investment in. What it tells you is something more profound. People often take away from this that, oh, Africa should be investing more and Asia should be investing more. So that is called analysis of proximate factors. Investment is a proximate factor. When you have more investment, you grow more. The question you have to ask yourself is, what is stopping people from investing? So, economics can be really misleading if you start attacking the symptoms. You say, oh, we need more investment. The question that needs to be asked is not that you need more investment. The question that needs to be asked is, why are people who are living in a society not investing more? Why are they automatically not investing more? Why isn't the domino process that started off in China, which has started off to some extent in India, the process that started in the 1960s in Korea, the process that started in Britain in 200 years ago, the domino process, why hasn't that domino process started? Why isn't there more investment? So you can't force more investment. And people who say you force more investment are just people who are saying, oh, we can just give foreign aid. If environment for investment is not hospitable, more investment is just going to be money down the drain, just like we saw in the Latin American experience. So, and you can see how understanding the hierarchy of infrastructure starts becoming critical in terms of making the environment more hospitable for investment. What is certainly true is that Africa has a unique geographical problem. It has a disadvantage. It has low population density. So other areas of the world have a higher population density. Latin America has low population density, but South Asia has higher population density. Population density tells you a lot about the cost of provision of public goods per capita. The denser the population, the cheaper it is per capita to provide public goods. Added to that, it has mountainous areas. And what is key is that it also has landlocked areas. So low population density, mountainous areas, landlocked. Landlocked is connected to the last lecture, waterways as public capital. So you need to create public capitals. If you create waterways, it's public capital that you create. But if you have waterways, you already have a country where you have public capital. So this is kind of natural capital. Now, what it does take away from, what we need to take away from this is not the fact that these problems are unsurmountable. So Netherlands have reclaimed land. Switzerland is a landlocked country and has been able to use initiative to make the geography more hospitable. But that requires a capacity of the government to work and provide the right kind of public goods. And Africa has lacked that. Developing countries lack that government capacity. So the paper, my paper, is related to this because it talks about fiscal capacity. Anyway, I'll come back to that. I mean, I'm running out of time here. So I'll come back to that next in the lecture, complete that thought. So one positive solution that has been presented is, why not just urbanization? So why not create centers of growth through urbanization? Because raising population density and providing public goods in highly dense populations is easier. So, you know, you can do that by prioritizing transport infrastructure for urban connectivity, increase residential density. So this particular paper, this particular set of ideas come from a paper. I'm just going to refer. It comes from this paper, right? And what Collier and Venables do is give you the cost of providing public goods in urban areas depending on the size of the city. And if you simply take water, what you see is larger the city, so larger the city, the cheaper it is to provide public goods, right? So if you want to start off a domino process, it's much, much easier to start off the domino process in an urban area than in a rural area. And of course, to rural areas, you want to provide public goods, it's going to cost you a lot. So one idea is to increase urbanization, but not just increase urbanization for the sake of urbanization, increase urbanization as centers of economic activity, which creates enough surplus to be able to create infrastructure in rural areas. And the process of development that we saw in developed countries was exactly this. So urbanization was a key process of the development process, and rural areas got infrastructure at a later stage. But this is one of the ideas of how you increase. And the key bit here is that as the cities get larger, for almost all public goods, you find that the cost of provision of public goods is cheaper. So there's a lovely quote from Collier and Venables that says, spatial configuration of economic activities in cities is dependent on infrastructure, as investment decisions of firms and households often respond to transport network. And urban connectivity creates an environment where firms and workers become more specialized and can reach an efficient scale of operation, right? So you can create urban hubs that become extremely productive. And you know, this is true not just for developing countries, this is true for all countries. Now, what Collier and Venables say about urbanization is this, that cities in East Asia and South Asia, they're often more dense. And African cities have been artisanal cities. They are characterized by low levels of investment in infrastructure and low levels of residential and business investment. So infrastructure and business and residential investment are complementary. If you get the right level of structure, you'll get more residential and business investment. But to a large extent, the point they're making is that African countries have remained artisanal countries. So now this is just one kind of interesting idea about how to push up productivity in Africa. I'm going to talk briefly about schools and hospital and relate this to transport and roads. So while everyone gets more excited about building roads because politicians can put their names on it, or you know, kind of it has a lasting legacy, health and education have both direct and indirect impact. So direct impact on the well-being of individuals. And they have an indirect impact through the economic production function. And the key bit is this: public provision of health and education is really important for the poorest of the poor and the rural areas. Urban areas and middle classes can often find ways of getting health and education that they need because they have the capacity to pay and they have high population density. It's the poorest of the poor and the rural areas that suffer. So often the development process, what it does is leaves one part of the population behind, and the people who are worst off in any country are the rural poor. The urban poor are better off. And there is a lovely paper on this. If you're interested, I can give you the reference to the paper. It's a paper by Banerjee and Duflo. And they find that rural poor are much worse off than urban poor, even though our television screens are full of urban poverty. Actually, urban poverty can be misleading because urban poverty, even though it looks terrible and makes for good television, it doesn't reflect the real poverty in the country, which comes from hunger, lack of education. And I still remember, I'm going to leave that story for another time. So the last idea that I want to put through is that one of the key things about delivering health and education is addressing the absence. So if you want to deliver something to public goods, the government delivers it to public goods. And what the government often finds it difficult to deal with is the rate of absence. So often healthcare workers and educational workers in schools and hospitals are absent because in remote areas. And the reason they're absent is because, one, it's more expensive for them to get there if there are no transport link. And the second is it's more expensive for the government to monitor whether they are there or not, right? So in that way, in the hierarchy of infrastructure projects, transport links become fundamental because it connects a region to the rest of the country. And what it does is not just create markets, which then can fund public goods, but it also lowers the cost of providing public goods to a rural area. Okay. So when you want to think about, often the practical choice you have is, let's say you have £1 million to spend in the area. Should you spend it on health, education, roads, or something else? People fight over this. People fight over this, what is the expression? Tooth and nail. And people who are experts in education say you should spend it on education. People who are experts in healthcare say you should spend it on healthcare. And people who are expert in transport links say it should be transport. And the question that we haven't still addressed in this area is, how do we organize these thoughts? The first £1 million, should you spend it on school, education, so school, health, or should you spend it on roads? And the reason it's difficult to answer this question is because how do you compare making an area more prosperous through road links to reducing deaths due to malaria in a country? These are the choices. These are stark choices. They're not easy to make. Right. So what I've tried to get to you in this lecture is this idea that while markets provide economic opportunity, markets lead to solo growth model processes working, capital accumulation. And what you want is a process of capital accumulation. What I've tried to get across is that solo growth model missed out. And it's not a criticism of solo growth model because it was written a long time ago, but it doesn't distinguish between public and private capital. And by not distinguishing between public and private capital, it obfuscates that area. And this is only key because public capital is complementary with respect to private capital. If there is no public capital, there will be no private capital. If there's no electricity, there'll be no private investment. If there's no roads and infrastructure, as you progress, you can allow markets to provide some form of public good. But initially, when it comes to starting off a process in a developing country, public capital becomes absolutely key. And it's not the quantity of the public capital, it's the quality. So the regulatory framework, initial roads, the quality of the public capital, it becomes absolutely critical, right? So hopefully the link between markets and markets leading the investment process, capital formation process, which lead to economic growth, but the critical role that public capital plays in that, that's what I wanted to get across. Now, I'm over the time, but I'm going to tell you a really interesting short thing to make the point, which is, I don't know if I've mentioned this before, but in 1986, there was a rocket called Challenger, which was launched. It had the first civilian on the rocket. It was a teacher. Everyone around the world was watching it, and I think about a few seconds into the flight, it blew up spectacularly in front of everyone's eyes. And I remember watching it as a kid, and it was absolutely the most shocking moment. One of the most shocking TV moments I remember. Now, there was an investigation established to look at why the Challenger blew up. And Richard Feynman, who was one of the leading physicists at that time, adored on Big Bang Theory, Richard Feynman. So if you're a fan of Big Bang Theory, you would have heard of Richard Feynman again and again. He was on the committee, and what they ended up discovering was that there was something like a $1 or 50 cents valve called the O-ring, and NASA had decided to buy a cheaper version, and the cheaper version would not respond well to temperature variation, and there was a huge temperature variation just before the launch. That broke, and that blew up the rocket. And that tells you something, and based around that, has developed, economics has developed a theory called the Oring Theory. And the idea is this: complementarities are extremely important. When things are substitutable, that means if one thing doesn't do it, another thing does it, right? So if public capital and private capital are substitutable, then public capital is not critical at all. This is the argument that everyone who says that government is not important, reduce the government. The argument they're making is that public capital and private capital are substitutable. If the public capital doesn't do it, if the government doesn't do it, private sector would do it. The key bit that I've been trying to point out through these series of lectures is that there's complementarity between public and private capital. It's a bit like the O-ring. You get the valve right, you can make sure that the rocket takes off properly. So all the critical processes are important. And often in getting the markets working, in getting the economic activity, the critical processes are important. And in development, one way to look at why a country is unable to reach its potential and not develop is because some of the critical processes have been thwarted or are not able to take place. So the role of complementarity between public and private capital is key to understanding the development process. If public capital and private capital were substitutable, then there is no reason why you should have developing countries, right? And through examples, and the devil is in the detail. Any kind of rhetorical argument on this misses the point. It's not that you need more roads. What you need is a decision-making process within a society that delivers the road at the right place and starts off the domino process. And that's the argument that this lecture was trying to make. And the other point the lecture was trying to make was that if you can start off that domino process through an urban process, create enough surplus, and once you create enough surplus in the urban areas, in the urban economic centers, you can cross-subsidize other parts of your country, right? That's it. I'm sorry, I'm over time, but you have a recording. If people have left, they have the recording for this. Any questions about this? Okay, I'll put up the term paper by tomorrow, but the term paper would basically ask you to connect the impact infrastructure can have on the economic growth and development. And the key to doing that properly would be to reflect your understanding of the course and talking about the pathways. A quick word about what I'm examining, the marking criteria. And, I'll talk again next week about this. And you can ask me any question. But the marking criteria is 20% is presentation. So can you write a good introduction or a conclusion? So conclusion that summarizes things well, introduction that creates the context and creates curiosity about the essay. So that's 20%. 50% is your knowledge of the course material. So have you understood? So when I say knowledge of the course material, it's not about the details and the footnotes and the papers. It's about the key concepts that you've learned in this lecture. Can you reflect that you understand it? And can you reflect that you understand it fully, not just repeat the definition, but understand it fully? So always keep that at the back of the mind. The 50% is you're not trying to make a rhetorical argument. You're trying to reflect that you have an understanding. 30% of the marking criteria would be taking that knowledge structure. Can you use that to effectively argue, right? So can you turn that into effective argument? So that's 30%. So that's the marking criteria. 50% is knowledge of the course material. So concepts taught in the course. And the concept that I'm talking about in the course, I repeat again and again. So it's not something that I want you to know something that I mentioned once. The concepts are like mantras. I keep repeating again and again. So have you absorbed those concepts? And can you use those concepts to argue effectively? And this is meant to reflect something. Your abilities to write this term paper is meant to reflect what you will do in any organization, whether private or public, that you'll work in. Key part is writing, communicating effectively, and arguing. So anything that you write, you often argue for a point that you're making and based on facts. So 50% is, do you have the knowledge of the facts in the marking criteria? And 30% is, can you turn that into effective argument, right? I'll talk more about it next week if you have questions, but that's what your term paper is going to look like. And if you have any concerns about this, if all of you collectively think that you want to nudge the term paper in a certain ways, I'm open to that. I'm open to the idea. I mean, I want this to be kind of examination by consensus. I don't want examination. I don't have an autocratic rule here. I'm happy to examine you in any way that you think is appropriate. Okay, that's it. I presume no more questions. Okay, thank you. And I'll see you next week. Bye. Bye.
Bye, thank you.
Bye, thank you.